My family cut me off for 8 years because of my poor husband. When companies sold for millions, Mom showed up with a written list demanding $870,000. Lorraine thought she could erase the past for cash. The moment I finally opened my compliance archive box, her greed was exposed. Welcome back to Van's Rock Stories. Have you ever watched someone judge the person you love before they even gave them a chance? If you've dealt with family pressure, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy real-life family drama stories, make sure to subscribe before we get into this one. My name is Natalie Hayes. I'm 35 years old, and for years I convinced myself my family would eventually accept my husband. I was wrong. I grew up in Fairmont, Indiana, in a family that cared a lot about appearances. Not just money, reputation, status, what people thought. My mother, Lorraine, especially cared about that. She always had opinions about people's careers, neighborhoods, education, and relationships. Growing up, I learned it was easier to avoid arguments than challenge her. Then I met Adrian Brooks. At the time, I was focused on my career and not looking for anything serious. Adrian changed that pretty quickly. He wasn't flashy. He didn't try to impress anyone. What stood out was how dependable he was. If he promised something, he did it. If someone needed help, he showed up. The more time we spent together, the more comfortable everything felt. No games, no drama, just honesty. A year later, I brought him to a family barbecue. I remember being excited for everyone to meet him. My dad was friendly. My sister was polite. My mother smiled. At least I thought she did. Looking back, it was the kind of smile people give when they've already formed an opinion. During lunch, she asked Adrian about his job. He answered every question respectfully. The conversation seemed fine. Later that afternoon, while we were cleaning up, Mom casually said, "He seems nice." I smiled. "He is." She hesitated. "He just doesn't seem very established." I laughed it off. "Mom, he's doing fine. I'm just making an observation." That phrase became a pattern. Every few weeks, there was another observation, another concern, another question. Are you sure your long-term goals match? Relationships can get complicated when finances aren't equal. Sometimes people mistake potential for stability. None of it sounded openly hostile. That was the problem. It was difficult to call out. Whenever I defended Adrian, Mom acted like she was only trying to help. Meanwhile, Adrian kept being himself. He worked hard. He treated people well. He never complained about my family. Even when I knew, he noticed the comments. As our relationship became more serious, my mother seemed to grow more uncomfortable. When Adrian and I started talking about marriage, she suddenly had more concerns than ever. One Saturday, Adrian spent nearly an entire day helping my parents with repairs around their house. I figured that might finally change her opinion. That evening, we all sat down for dinner. Mom looked at Adrian and said, "He's certainly willing to work hard." I smiled. "He always is." She nodded. "Sometimes hard work isn't enough." The table went quiet. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged her. The conversation simply moved on. Later, during the drive home, I apologized. Adrian stared at the road for a moment. "It's okay." "No, it isn't." He shrugged. "I know she doesn't like me." I immediately disagreed. "She doesn't dislike you." But even as I said it, I wasn't completely sure anymore. Over the next several months, I found myself defending Adrian constantly. Not from attacks, from suggestions, doubts, concerns, comments that always seemed harmless until you added them all together. Then came a family dinner that changed the way I saw everything. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody raised their voice. Halfway through the meal, the conversation turned to relationships and future plans. My mother listened quietly. Then she set down her fork and looked directly at me. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. She glanced at Adrian before looking back at me. Then she asked, "Are you really sure you want this to be the rest of your life?" For a second, nobody said anything. My mother wasn't yelling. She wasn't even being rude on the surface. That was what made it uncomfortable. The question hung there while everyone stared at their plates. I looked at Adrian. He gave a small shrug, like he was trying to help me let it go. "I'm sure," I said. Mom nodded slowly. "Okay." Then she changed the subject. Just like that. Nobody challenged her. Nobody asked what she meant. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether my family approved of Adrian. The real question was how much they disapproved. A few months later, Adrian proposed. It wasn't elaborate. No cameras. No huge surprise. Just the two of us after dinner at a small restaurant we'd been going to for years. I still remember laughing because I was so shocked that I forgot to answer immediately. Adrian looked nervous for maybe the first time since I'd known him. "So, should I be worried?" he asked. I laughed. "Yes, you should be worried." His face dropped. Then I kissed him. Because the answer is yes. That was one of the happiest nights of my life. The next morning, I called my parents. Dad sounded pleased. Mom sounded polite. There was a difference. "Oh," she said. "Well, that's certainly exciting." Certainly exciting. Not congratulations. Not we're happy for you. Just certainly exciting. I ignored it. At least I tried to. Over the next few weeks, we started planning the wedding. Nothing huge. Just a simple ceremony with family and close friends. I kept expecting everyone to warm up once they realized Adrian wasn't going anywhere. Instead, things became stranger. Not openly hostile, just awkward. Calls became shorter. Family dinners became less frequent. Whenever I brought up wedding plans, the conversation seemed to lose energy. One afternoon, I met my older sister for lunch. I hoped talking one-on-one might help. For a while, everything felt normal. We talked about work, vacation plans, family gossip. Then I mentioned the wedding venue. She immediately became interested in her salad. "Looks nice," she said. "That's it?" She laughed awkwardly. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something." She avoided eye contact. "Natalie, I just don't want to get involved." That answer bothered me more than criticism would have. Involved in what? Nobody was fighting, at least not openly. I started making more effort. Lunches, coffee meetups, phone calls, anything that might clear the tension. Every conversation ended the same way. Nobody would actually say what the problem was, but nobody seemed excited either. Whenever I asked direct questions, people suddenly became careful, or they pointed me back toward Mom. "Have you talked to Lorraine? Your mom probably explained it better. Maybe ask your mother." At some point, I realized something strange. My relatives weren't speaking for themselves anymore. They were speaking through her, as if she'd already had conversations with everyone that I wasn't part of. One evening, I sat on the couch scrolling through wedding planning notes while Adrian finished some work on his laptop. "You've been quiet," he said. I looked up. "I'm trying to figure out what happened." "With your family?" "Yeah." He closed the laptop. "Natalie." The tone of his voice immediately got my attention. "You don't have to keep fixing this." "I'm not fixing it." "You kind of are." I sighed. "No, I'm trying to make everyone comfortable." He smiled gently. "See? That's exactly what I mean." I hated that he had a point. Because every week seemed to become another attempt to manage everyone's feelings. Everyone except my own. As invitations started going out, things became even harder to ignore. Friends responded quickly. His family responded quickly. My family responded slowly. Very slowly. Some relatives said they needed to check schedules. Others said they weren't sure yet. A few never answered at all. Mom kept assuring me everything would work itself out. "People are busy," she said. "You're overthinking." Maybe I wanted to believe her. Maybe I needed to. Then, one Saturday morning, a few weeks before the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the guest list. Several names still had no response. That didn't make sense. These were relatives who had personally told me they planned to come. I picked up my phone and started checking messages. No replies. I checked email. Nothing. I tried calling one of my cousins. Straight to voicemail. Then another. No answer. Then another. The more names I checked, the stranger it felt. People who had promised they would be there had suddenly gone completely silent, and nobody seemed interested in explaining why. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. People got busy. Plans changed. Life happened. But the closer we got to the wedding, the harder that explanation became to believe. Several relatives who had promised to come suddenly became difficult to reach. A few eventually declined. The reasons sounded different, but the conversations felt the same. Short. Awkward. Like everyone wanted to end the call as quickly as possible. One evening, I finally asked my mother directly, "What's going on?" "What do you mean?" "People keep backing out." Mom sighed. "Natalie, people make their own decisions." That was technically an answer, just not the one I was looking for. The wedding kept moving forward anyway. At some point, Adrian and I stopped trying to convince people to attend and focused on the people who actually wanted to celebrate with us. Honestly, that made things easier. "You seem less stressed," Adrian told me one night. "I think I'm just tired." He laughed. "Good. Maybe now you'll stop trying to manage everyone else's feelings." I wanted to argue. Instead, I changed the subject, because he wasn't wrong. As my family became more distant, his family seemed to move closer. His mother called to check on wedding plans. His father offered help whenever we needed it. His sister jumped in whenever something unexpected came up. Nothing dramatic. Just consistent support. The kind that shows you who's really in your corner. A few days before the ceremony, one of my bridesmaids looked over the guest list. "How many family members are coming?" I glanced at the names. Not many. The room went quiet for a second. Then someone quickly changed the topic. Nobody wanted to make me feel worse. The wedding day arrived before I felt ready for it. I wasn't nervous about marrying Adrian. That part was easy. I was nervous about looking out into the crowd, about seeing who wasn't there, about noticing empty seats. For a while, that's exactly what happened. Every time the door opened, I found myself looking. Every new arrival made me wonder if another relative had changed their mind. Most didn't. Some canceled. Some never responded at all. No explanation. No apology. Nothing. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted a huge wedding, because these were people who had been part of my life for decades, and somehow showing up for a few hours had become too much to ask. A few minutes before the ceremony, I felt myself getting emotional. Not crying, just struggling to keep everything together. Then Adrian found me. He took one look at my face and smiled. "Still want to marry me?" I laughed. "Absolutely." "Good." He squeezed my hand. "Then let's focus on the people who showed up." That simple sentence changed my entire day. The people who showed up. Not the people who didn't. The people who showed up. When I finally walked down the aisle, that's what I focused on. My friends. The people cheering for us. Adrian waiting at the front. His family smiling. The ceremony was simple, but it felt real. For a few hours, the disappointment faded. Not completely, but enough. When we exchanged vows, something shifted. For years, Adrian and I had been trying to fit our relationship into my family's expectations. Standing there, I stopped caring whether it fit. We were building our own family now. The honeymoon was exactly what we needed. A chance to breathe. A chance to enjoy being newly married. And by the time we came home, I genuinely believed things might improve. Maybe everyone just needed time. The holidays were approaching, so I decided to make the first move. I picked a photo from the honeymoon, wrote a short note, signed it from both of us. Then I mailed holiday cards to my family. Nothing complicated. Just a simple reminder that the door was still open. A few weeks later, I came home from work and checked the mailbox. One envelope immediately caught my attention. I recognized my handwriting. It was one of the holiday cards. Returned. Still sealed. Unopened. I stood in the kitchen holding that returned holiday card longer than I care to admit. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't lost in the mail. Someone had made a decision. Someone had received it and sent it back. Adrian walked in, saw the envelope, and immediately understood. He didn't ask questions. He just wrapped an arm around my shoulders. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I set the card down and tried to move on. That's what I kept doing during those first few years of marriage. Trying to move on. Trying not to make a big deal out of things. Trying to believe the next attempt would be different. A few months later, my mother's birthday came around. I mailed a card. No response. When my father's birthday arrived, I mailed another. Nothing. Christmas came again. I sent cards. No response. Sometimes the envelopes disappeared completely. Sometimes they came back. Most of the time, I had no idea what happened to them. The uncertainty almost made it worse. At least a returned envelope gave me an answer. Silence gave me nothing. Still, I kept trying. Not because I enjoyed being ignored, because giving up felt permanent. As long as I was reaching out, there was still a chance things could improve. At least, that's what I told myself. Whenever friends asked about my family, I usually gave the same answer. We're working through some things. It sounded better than the truth. The truth was that nobody seemed interested in working through anything. One Saturday, Adrian and I hosted a small barbecue for friends. A few days before the event, I mailed invitations to several relatives. Nothing formal. Just a casual family gathering. Good food, good company. An easy opportunity to reconnect. The barbecue came and went. Not one family member showed up. Not even the ones who lived nearby. A few days later, Mom called about something completely unrelated. She never mentioned the invitation. Neither did I. The entire conversation felt strangely normal. That somehow made it worse. Years weren't passing yet, but patterns were forming. And patterns are harder to ignore than individual incidents. One evening, Adrian found me addressing another stack of holiday cards. He looked at the envelopes, then at me. Can I ask something? Sure. Why do you keep doing this? His voice wasn't critical, just genuinely curious. I put down my pen. I don't know. You do know. I stared at the cards for a second. Because if I stop, it feels like I'm the one ending the relationship. Adrian nodded slowly. He understood. But I could tell he didn't agree. The difference between us was becoming obvious. I still expected improvement. He didn't. He had stopped waiting for acceptance long before I had. As time went on, I became more organized without really planning to. Whenever a card came back, I tossed it into a drawer. Whenever an invitation went unanswered, I kept a copy. If I sent photos, I usually saved extras. It wasn't some dramatic archive. Not yet. Mostly, it was habit. Paperwork collecting in a corner of my office, evidence of effort I couldn't quite bring myself to throw away. Life itself was actually pretty good. That was the strange part. My marriage was strong. My career was moving forward. Adrian and I were building a future together. Most days were normal. Happy, even. The family situation wasn't consuming my life. It was more like a persistent ache. Something I noticed whenever another holiday arrived, or another birthday, or another family milestone passed without contact. Then one afternoon, I attended a distant cousin's graduation party. One of the few family events I was still invited to. The atmosphere was polite, a little awkward, but manageable. I spent most of the afternoon chatting with relatives I hadn't seen in months. Near the end of the event, one older cousin pulled me aside. Nothing serious, just casual conversation. We talked about work, marriage, life. Then she mentioned something that made me stop. "Oh, by the way," she said, "I saw your letter at Lorraine's house a while back." I blinked. "My letter?" "Yeah. It was sitting on her kitchen counter." I stared at her. "What letter?" She shrugged. "I don't know. A few months ago, maybe. I just remember seeing your name on the envelope. A few months ago." One of the letters that had never received a response. One of the letters I assumed had disappeared. My cousin took a sip of her drink and continued talking, but I barely heard the rest. Because for the first time, I wasn't wondering whether my messages were reaching my family. I was wondering what happened after they arrived. The comment from my cousin stayed with me for weeks. Not because it was dramatic, because it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to believe. My letters weren't disappearing. At least some of them were being received. They just weren't being answered. Oddly enough, that realization didn't start a fight. I didn't call my mother. I didn't demand explanations. I was tired. Not angry. Just tired. Life was getting busier anyway. Around that time, Adrian and I were putting almost everything we had into a small business venture that would eventually become Integrity Solutions Group. Back then, it sounded much more impressive than it actually was. In reality, it was mostly long workdays, spreadsheets, late-night conversations, and constant uncertainty. We worked from a cramped home office that barely had enough space for both of us. Money wasn't terrible, but it wasn't comfortable either. Every expense mattered. Every client mattered. Every contract mattered. I was still working in compliance while helping wherever I could. Adrian was carrying a huge part of the workload himself. There were weeks when it felt like all we did was work, sleep, and repeat. The funny thing is, those years were stressful, but they were also some of the happiest years of my life, because we were building something together. One night, around midnight, I walked into the office and found Adrian asleep at his desk. His laptop was still open. A spreadsheet was on the screen. I took a picture before waking him up. He still hates that photo. I still have it. "Come to bed," I told him. He looked at the clock. I was just resting my eyes. "Sure you were." Even during difficult periods, moments like that made everything feel worth it. For the first time, I wasn't spending every day worrying about my family's approval. I was focused on creating my own future. Then life got even busier. I found out I was pregnant. Actually, we found out we were having twins. That conversation is still one of my favorites. The technician said it so casually. "There are two." Adrian immediately looked confused. "Two what?" The technician laughed. "Babies." I've never seen someone look simultaneously thrilled and terrified before. Until that moment. Mason and Ella arrived a few months later and completely changed our lives. Sleep disappeared. Free time disappeared. Schedules stopped making sense. But somehow, everything became better. The twins quickly became the center of our world. Naturally, I thought their birth might reopen communication with my family, even if they had issues with me, even if they had issues with Adrian. Surely they'd want a relationship with the children. I sent announcements, photos, updates, holiday cards featuring the twins. A few messages were acknowledged through relatives. Most weren't. Sometimes I'd hear secondhand that my family knew about the kids, that they'd seen pictures, that they'd heard updates. But very little came directly from them. No excited phone calls, no requests to visit, no genuine effort. The absence was becoming normal. That realization hurt more than the silence itself. Because normal meant I was adjusting to it. Meanwhile, Adrian's family showed up constantly. Birthdays, family dinners, babysitting emergencies, school events later on. The support wasn't perfect. No family is perfect, but they were present, and presence matters. Over time, I stopped talking about my mother as often, not intentionally. There was simply less to say. Lorraine became less like an active person in my life, and more like an empty space where a relationship used to be. Years earlier, that would have devastated me. Now it mostly felt disappointing. One evening, after the twins were asleep, I sat in my office trying to organize paperwork that had accumulated over the years. Most of it was business-related: contracts, client records, tax documents, the usual things. Mixed into one pile were old cards, copies of letters, invitations, and returned envelopes. Pieces of a completely different part of my life. I started sorting them. At first, it was just about cleaning up. Then I noticed how much there actually was. Birthday cards, holiday cards, family invitations, photos I'd mailed, letters I'd written, many with no response attached to them. I stared at the stack for a moment. Then I grabbed an empty folder from a cabinet. Instead of throwing everything away, I labeled it Family Correspondence. And for the first time, I created a dedicated file for every unanswered attempt I'd made to stay connected. The folder started as a simple filing system, nothing more. Whenever a card came back or a letter went unanswered, I dropped a copy inside and moved on. At least, that was the plan. What actually happened was that life got busy enough that I stopped thinking about it very often. The twins were growing fast. The business was finally becoming stable. For the first time in years, Adrian and I weren't wondering whether we'd have enough clients next month. We weren't rich. Not even close. But we weren't constantly stressed about money anymore either. That alone felt like a huge victory. Most evenings were pretty ordinary. Dinner, homework, bath time, trying to convince two energetic kids that bedtime wasn't a personal attack. Normal family stuff. Honestly, those were some of my favorite years. Not because everything was perfect, because it wasn't, but because our life felt solid. We'd built something real together. One night, Mason walked into the kitchen while I was making dinner. He couldn't have been more than 7. "Mom?" "Yeah? Why don't we ever visit your grandparents?" I stopped stirring the pasta. Just for a second. Then I looked over my shoulder. "What made you think about that?" He shrugged. "Everybody else talks about grandparents." A few minutes later, Ella joined the conversation. Kids have a way of appearing whenever something interesting is happening. "Do we have more grandparents?" I smiled. "You do." "Where are they?" There it was. The question I'd been avoiding for years. Not because I didn't have an answer, because I didn't know how to give one. I didn't want them carrying my disappointment. Children shouldn't inherit adult conflicts. So I kept it simple. "They live a few hours away." "Do they not like driving?" Ella asked. I nearly laughed. The innocence of that question hit me harder than I expected. "No, sweetheart. It's more complicated than that." She accepted the answer immediately. Kids often do. Adults are the ones who keep digging. That night, after the twins were asleep, I told Adrian about the conversation. He nodded quietly. I wondered when they'd start asking. "Me too." "You handled it well." "I'm not sure." "You didn't make it their problem." That was what I cared about most. Whatever happened between me and my family, I didn't want the twins feeling rejected by people they'd barely met. As the years passed, I noticed something else. I talked about my family less and less. Not intentionally. It just happened. At some point, they stopped being part of our daily lives. No phone calls, no visits, no invitations, no real relationship. The silence had become routine. One afternoon, I was looking through old photos while helping the twins put together a school project. The timeline stretched across several years. Birthdays, soccer games, school events, family vacations, business milestones, anniversaries. I noticed something strange. Or maybe not strange. Just obvious. My family wasn't in any of it. Not one birthday party, not one school event, not one holiday gathering. Years of memories existed without them. For a while I sat there staring at the photos. Not sad, exactly. More thoughtful. The distance wasn't temporary anymore. It had become history. Later that evening, Adrian noticed me looking through the album again. "You okay?" "Yeah," I smiled, just realizing how much time has passed. He sat beside me. Neither of us said much after that. We didn't need to. The years had changed both of us. The constant tension that used to surround my family had mostly disappeared, not because the situation improved, because we'd stopped building our lives around the possibility that it might. A few weeks later, I attended a professional networking event for work. Mostly boring conversations, business cards, small talk, the usual. Near the end of the evening, I ran into someone I'd known years earlier through family connections. We spent a few minutes catching up. Work, kids, life, the standard conversation. Then she casually said something that caught me off guard. "Oh, your mother must be so proud of everything you've accomplished." I blinked. "What makes you say that?" She looked surprised. "Well, she talks about you all the time." I laughed before I could stop myself. "No, she doesn't." The woman looked genuinely confused. "Sure she does." Suddenly I wasn't laughing anymore. She continued. "I mean, maybe not directly, but she always seems to know what's going on with your business, your kids, where you've traveled." She kept talking. I barely heard the rest, because one thought kept repeating in my head. For years, my family had acted like I barely existed, yet somehow they seemed to know exactly what was happening in my life. "She always seems to know what's going on with your business, your kids, where you've traveled." That comment followed me all the way home. Not because it was shocking, because it explained a lot. For years, my family had acted completely uninterested in my life. Yet somehow they seemed surprisingly informed. When I told Adrian about the conversation, he wasn't nearly as surprised as I was. He took a sip of coffee and shrugged. "They probably follow you online." Without talking to me? Apparently. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. The idea that people could ignore phone calls, invitations, birthdays, and holidays while quietly monitoring social media felt absurd. And yet, it made perfect sense. Over the following months, Integrity Solutions Group entered a new stage. For the first time, things were growing faster than we expected. We hired additional staff, landed larger contracts, expanded into new markets. The business still demanded long hours, but now the hard work was producing visible results. Naturally, I shared some of those milestones online. Nothing flashy. A company anniversary, a team celebration, photos from conferences, normal professional updates. Then something strange started happening. Names I hadn't seen in years began appearing in my notifications. A cousin liked a post. An aunt left a comment. A relative I hadn't spoken to in forever suddenly sent a friend request. At first I assumed it was coincidence. Then it kept happening. One evening I opened a message from a cousin who hadn't spoken to me in almost 6 years. "Hey Natalie, just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." The message looked friendly enough. I answered politely. We exchanged a few updates. Work, family, the kids. Normal conversation. Then the topic shifted. "So how's the company doing these days?" There it was. Subtle, but noticeable. I answered vaguely and moved on. A week later, another relative reached out. The conversation followed almost the exact same pattern. Friendly greeting, small talk, questions about the twins, then eventually, business. Not directly about money. Not yet, but close. "Sounds like things are really taking off. You guys must be incredibly busy. That's exciting growth." The comments themselves weren't offensive. What bothered me was the timing. Years of silence. then sudden interest. I started noticing the same thing everywhere. Relatives who had ignored wedding invitations were suddenly commenting on company achievements. People who never acknowledged birthdays were reacting to business updates. Nobody mentioned the missing years. Nobody acknowledged the distance. It was as if they'd collectively decided to skip over an entire chapter of history. One Sunday afternoon, Adrian noticed me staring at my phone. "Another one?" I looked up. "How did you know?" "Because you've got that look." "What look?" "The look you get when someone pretends nothing happened." I laughed. That was exactly it. Nobody was apologizing. Nobody was explaining. They were simply showing up and acting like we were all still close. The more it happened, the less comfortable I felt. Part of me wanted to enjoy it. Part of me wanted to believe people were genuinely reconnecting, but another part kept asking the same question. Why now? One evening, I received a message from a relative I hadn't heard from since before Mason and Ella started school. The message was unusually warm. We exchanged updates for nearly 20 minutes. Family stories, work stories, a little nostalgia. For a moment, it actually felt normal. Then she asked a question. A very specific question. The kind of question that immediately made me sit up straighter. "So with all the growth you've had..." I stared at the screen. The next message appeared a few seconds later. "Out of curiosity, what do you think the company would be worth if you ever sold it?" "What do you think the company would be worth if you ever sold it?" I stared at that message for a few seconds. Not because I didn't know the answer, because it was such a strange question, especially coming from someone who hadn't spoken to me in years. I replied with something vague and changed the subject. The conversation ended shortly afterward. That should have been the end of it. Instead, similar questions started appearing from different people. Not the exact same wording, the same idea. "Business must be doing really well. Have investors approached you? Do you ever think about selling?" It was becoming a pattern. By then, Integrity Solutions Group had grown far beyond anything Adrian and I imagined in those early days. What started in a cramped home office had become a respected company with a strong client base and a talented team. And eventually, a serious acquisition offer arrived. Then another. Then another. For months, our lives revolved around meetings, negotiations, attorneys, financial reviews, and endless paperwork. It was exciting, exhausting, and honestly, a little surreal. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found Adrian staring at a stack of documents. "Please tell me we're almost done." He laughed. "I've been saying that for 6 months." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I've got." The process seemed endless, but eventually everything came together. The sale closed. Years of work suddenly became something tangible, something measurable. I still remember sitting in silence afterward, not celebrating, not crying, just trying to process it. We'd actually done it. The company we'd built from scratch had been sold in a multi-million-dollar transaction. That moment felt less like winning the lottery and more like crossing a finish line after an incredibly long race. For a few weeks, life felt wonderful. Adrian and I took a breath for the first time in years. We spent more time with the kids, talked about future plans, discussed opportunities we'd never considered before. Then the news started spreading, not through announcements from us, through business circles, professional contacts, mutual acquaintances. People talk, especially in smaller communities. Suddenly, everyone seemed to know, and once people knew, my phone became much more active. I received more messages that month than I'd received from relatives in several previous years combined. Some were congratulations, some were friendly check-ins. Some felt oddly enthusiastic considering the amount of silence that came before them. The strangest part wasn't the attention, it was what nobody mentioned. Nobody talked about the wedding. Nobody talked about the holidays. Nobody talked about the unanswered letters. Nobody talked about the years. It was like those years had been deleted from everyone's memory. One cousin sent a message that started with, "We should really get together soon." I stared at it. Soon? We hadn't spoken in almost 7 years. Another relative commented on nearly every social media post for weeks. A woman who hadn't acknowledged the existence of my children suddenly seemed fascinated by their activities. I found myself becoming cautious, not angry, just careful. Whenever messages arrived, I responded politely. But I stopped sharing much. I stopped volunteering information. I started setting boundaries without announcing them. One evening, Adrian noticed, "You've become selective." Is that a nice way of saying suspicious? It's a nice way of saying realistic. I laughed. Fair enough. He leaned back in his chair. Then his expression changed. Not serious exactly, concerned. "I think something bigger is coming." That comment stuck with me, because part of me agreed. Another part still wanted to believe some of these people were genuine. Maybe they regretted the distance. Maybe they wanted another chance. Maybe not every conversation had a hidden agenda. I wasn't ready to completely close the door. Then my phone rang one afternoon while I was working. I glanced at the screen. For a second, I honestly thought I was reading it wrong, because I hadn't seen that name calling me in years. Lorraine, my mother. I answered. There was a brief pause on the line. Then her voice. Calm, friendly, almost unusually friendly. "Natalie? Hi, Mom." Another pause. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "I was wondering if I could come visit you sometime." I must have replayed that sentence 100 times. Not because it was complicated, because it was my mother. After all those years, she wanted to visit. When I hung up, Adrian was sitting across from me at the kitchen table. That looked serious. I nodded. "Mom wants to come over." He didn't say anything immediately. That alone told me a lot. A younger version of me would have started celebrating. This version was more careful. Still, I couldn't stop a small part of me from feeling hopeful. Maybe she'd finally decided enough time had passed. Maybe she wanted to know her grandchildren. Maybe she regretted everything. I didn't know. But for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a better outcome. The visit was scheduled for the following weekend, and despite telling myself not to overthink it, I absolutely overthought it. I cleaned the house more thoroughly than necessary, not because it needed cleaning, because I was nervous. I found myself wondering where everyone would sit, what we'd talk about, whether the twins would feel comfortable, whether Mom would apologize. I didn't need some dramatic speech, just acknowledgement, just honesty, something. One evening, Ella asked why I kept rearranging things in the living room. "We're having a visitor." "Who?" I hesitated, then smiled. "Your grandmother." Both kids looked confused. Not upset, just confused. That hurt more than I expected, because they genuinely didn't know who she was. They'd heard stories, seen a few old photographs, but there was no real relationship there. No memories, no connection, just a title. Grandmother. The morning of the visit felt strangely similar to waiting for an important job interview. I kept checking the clock, checking my phone, checking things that didn't need checking. Adrian eventually laughed. "You know she's just coming over, right?" "I know." "You've looked calmer during business negotiations." "That's different." "How?" I thought about it. Those people usually answer emails. That got a laugh out of both of us. But underneath the joke, my nerves were real. When Mom finally arrived, I felt my stomach tighten. 8 years. Almost 8 years. And now she was standing on my front porch. She smiled when I opened the door. Not the polite social smile I remembered. A warmer one. At least it seemed warm. "Natalie." "Hi, Mom." For a second, I genuinely thought she might hug me. Instead, she stepped inside. Everything felt oddly formal, like two people trying to remember how to interact. The twins appeared from the hallway a few minutes later. I made introductions. Mom smiled. The kids smiled back. Everyone was polite. Everyone was friendly. But it was impossible to ignore the awkwardness. They were meeting a stranger who happened to share their DNA. I kept waiting for Mom to ask questions about school, about their hobbies, about their lives. She asked a few, briefly. Nothing wrong with the questions, nothing especially personal either. The conversation drifted around safe topics: weather, the house, the neighborhood, the business, always the business. Eventually, the twins wandered off to do their own thing. Adrian excused himself to give us privacy, and suddenly it was just me and my mother sitting across from each other. Part of me thought this was it, the real conversation, the moment we'd finally address everything: the wedding, the silence, the years. I waited. Mom reached beside her chair, picked up a large folder I'd barely noticed when she arrived, then she placed it on the coffee table. My heart sank a little, not because I knew what was inside, because I suddenly realized she hadn't come empty-handed. She opened the folder. Several pages were neatly organized inside, typed, highlighted, labeled. Very organized, very deliberate. Mom adjusted her glasses and looked down at the papers. I spent some time putting this together. I stared at the folder, then back at her. "What is it?" She smiled. The same calm, businesslike smile she'd used my entire life whenever she thought something was perfectly reasonable. A list of things the family could really use help with. Before I could respond, she unfolded the pages and began reading through financial requests worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mom glanced down at the paper and continued, $80,000 to help your aunt pay off some debt. Another page, $150,000 for your sister's new home. Then another, and another. I sat there listening while she worked through the list. The numbers kept climbing. 50,000 here, 90,000 there, 100,000 for something else. At first I thought I was misunderstanding. Maybe these were examples. Maybe she was explaining family problems. Maybe she was building toward an actual conversation. She wasn't. These were requests. Real requests. By the time she finished, the total was somewhere around $870,000. I remember staring at the stack of papers, then at my mother, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the moment she'd laugh and say she was joking. It never came. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. So that's basically everything. Everything. The word hung in the air. Not everything we'd missed. Not everything that happened during 8 years. Everything they wanted. I looked down at the pages again. There were notes, calculations, explanations, estimated amounts. She'd spent time preparing this. A lot of time. More time, apparently, than she'd spent getting to know her grandchildren. I took a slow breath. "Mom?" "Yes." "When did you put this together?" "A few weeks ago." "A few weeks." That answer somehow hurt more than the list itself, because it meant this wasn't impulsive. This was planned. Carefully planned. I waited for her to say something else. Anything else. An apology. Acknowledgement. Regret. Instead, she pointed at one section. "I think these are all reasonable." Reasonable. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I honestly didn't know what else to do. She kept talking, explaining family situations, financial difficulties, opportunities people didn't want to miss, problems that could supposedly be solved. The entire conversation revolved around money, nothing else. At one point, I realized something strange. Mom hadn't asked me a single meaningful question since arriving. Not about my life, Not about the business. Not about the years we'd lost. Not about the twins. She knew their names, but she didn't know them. And apparently she wasn't interested in changing that. I thought about all the things I had imagined before this visit. Maybe she'd apologize. Maybe she'd explain. Maybe she'd finally tell me why everyone disappeared after I married Adrian. Maybe we'd start rebuilding something. Instead, I was sitting across from a woman who seemed to believe 8 years of silence could be skipped entirely, as if we could simply continue where we left off, as if history had no cost. I glanced toward the hallway where the twins had disappeared earlier, then toward the kitchen where Adrian was giving us space. My family. The one I'd actually built. The one that had been there every day. For years, I'd kept trying to prove something, trying to earn acceptance, trying to explain Adrian, trying to make people understand. Sitting there, I suddenly felt exhausted by the entire effort. Not angry, not emotional, just finished. Mom was still talking. And your sister has been looking at properties, so the timing would really help. I nodded once, then looked directly at her. Did you ever read them? She frowned. Read what? The letters. The room became quiet. For the first time all afternoon, she didn't have an immediate answer. Just a brief pause, a small shift in her expression. Then she looked away, only for a second. But I noticed. Years of compliance work had trained me to notice things. People reveal a lot during moments of hesitation. Mom eventually cleared her throat. We're talking about the family right now. Exactly. The family. Always the family. Just never the damage. Never the years. Never the choices. Something inside me settled at that moment. A decision. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just clear. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to defend myself. And I definitely wasn't going to debate whether 8 years of absence should cost $870,000. Mom seemed to mistake my silence for agreement. She relaxed slightly, as if she believed the conversation was moving in the direction she expected. Instead, I stood up. Natalie, I'll be right back. She looked confused. I walked out of the room, past the kitchen, past my office door. Then I opened a storage cabinet and reached for a large archive box that had been growing quietly for years. The archive box was heavier than it looked. I carried it back into the living room and set it on the coffee table between us. Mom frowned. What is this? I opened the lid and pulled out the first envelope, a Christmas card, still sealed inside the returned mailing envelope, then another, and another. Her expression slowly changed. Natalie, just give me a minute. My voice stayed calm. That surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done arguing. Inside the box were copies of birthday cards, holiday messages, family invitations, photos of the twins, and letters I'd sent over the years. Every item was dated. Every item told the same story. I reached out. Nobody answered. I didn't lecture her. I didn't accuse her. I simply laid the evidence in front of her. A birthday invitation with no reply. A holiday card returned unopened. Photos of Mason and Ella that were never acknowledged. Letters that disappeared into silence. The room became quiet. For years, I worked in compliance. Documentation matters. People forget. People change their version of events. Documents don't. Mom stared at the pile. You kept all of this? Yes. Why? I looked at the box. Because I was afraid one day someone would say none of it happened. She didn't respond. This wasn't for revenge, I said. I just didn't want the story rewritten. Her eyes settled on the first holiday card Adrian and I had mailed after our honeymoon, the one that came back unopened. For a moment, she looked emotional, but she still didn't apologize. Instead, she quietly said, "Things were complicated." I nodded. They were. Then I looked at her. But they weren't complicated for 8 years. That landed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The conversation that followed wasn't satisfying. There was no breakthrough. No perfect reconciliation. Mostly explanations and excuses. For the first time, I didn't try to convince her of anything. I simply let the box speak for itself. Eventually, she closed the folder containing the financial requests, the list that had brought her there. Suddenly, it looked very small beside 8 years of evidence. "We should talk again sometime," she said. "Maybe?" That was the most honest answer I could give. A little while later, she left. No money, no agreement, no apology, just a quiet goodbye. When her car disappeared down the street, I stood on the porch for a moment. Adrian joined me. "How are you feeling?" I thought about it. Certain. That was the difference. Not happy, not sad, certain. The months afterward were mostly quiet. A few relatives reached out. Most didn't. Life kept moving. The twins kept growing. The business kept running. The only surprise was my father. Robert started calling occasionally. The conversations were awkward, but they felt genuine. He asked about the kids. He asked about life. He never asked about money. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was real. Looking back, that meeting didn't give me closure. What it gave me was proof. For years, I wondered if I should have tried harder, called more, explained more, waited longer. The archive box answered those questions. I had tried, again and again. The meeting ended without money, without reconciliation, without a clean ending. But after 8 years, I finally accepted something I'd spent too long questioning. I wasn't the one who walked away. If this story connected with you, remember that sometimes peace comes from accepting the truth, even when the truth isn't the ending you hoped for. Some relationships can be repaired. Others simply reveal who was willing to stay and who wasn't. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your story, and don't forget to subscribe to Van's Rock Stories for more powerful real-life drama. Thank you for listening. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.